participate in the meeting may do so in the following manner by finding the meeting at southboroughtown.com/remote meetings. No in-person attendance by members of the public will be permitted, but every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access the proceedings in real time via technological means. In the event we are unable to do so, despite best efforts, we will post on Southborough's website an audio or video recording, transcript, or other comprehensive record of the proceedings as soon as possible after the meeting. Okay. So the first item on the agenda is schools, but I don't see Katura. So we may have to hold that one. Did you hear from Katura at all, Judith?
Yes, I did. She has a school committee meeting tonight. Unfortunately, those meetings at the same time as ours.
Oh, okay.
So she sends her apologies. She is going to go through the goals and recommendations with the committee tonight. So she'll get back to me with any feedback on that. So, but I think she felt that they'd be, no major changes. A bit dark. Let me see. Sorry, I'm just going to go see if I can find another light to put on here. I'm sure you all want to see my beautiful face.
Absolutely. And then the next thing was recreation, and I heard from Kristen, she said she was going to be here, but I don't see her yet.
I think she might be a little late.
Okay.
Because I think there was something that she had on, but she's definitely said she was going to join us.
Okay. So
there we go.
Oh, there she is.
There you see. Her ears.
Kristen, just in time.
She's muted.
Kristen, do you want to go over the goals and recommendations for the Recreation Commission?
Sure, and sorry, I had technical issues. I thought tonight we were doing open space. I did confirm with the Recreation Commission yesterday that what we presented at the last master plan committee was not, it was final, was not going to be changed. So at this point, we're working on using what we agreed to last night was based on the 2008 open space and recreation plan. We would incorporate the goals into that along with the verbiage, the kind of the verbiage around those, and provide those back to the team. So I apologize in speaking with Judith, and I may have misunderstood. I thought tonight we were doing open space and then would layer in the recreation. So that's what we discussed last night at recreation, that over the next few days we would, again, no changes to what we reviewed in a meeting a couple weeks, not a couple weeks, 2 meetings ago. And now we would just see if there was anything in the overall paragraphs that we would edit from 2008.
Yeah, sorry, that's what we just wanted to confirm, that there was nothing else that you were going to change from the goals and rec. So that's good. Yeah, we said we'd take your draft section next time because we've already got a few stacked up for tonight.
Yeah. So.
Okay. So the goals and recommendations are fine with the that we had. Okay, perfect. Check.
And I just want to apologize now. I'm going to be trying to switch over to another computer. Long story. My son needs to take his phone from me at 8 o'clock, so I'm just trying to navigate. So I'm not surfing the web. I'm just trying to get set up on another computer.
Okay. So then public services?
Yeah, so let me just share my screen, if I may. So this, wait a minute. Let's see if I can get this to go the right way around.
Yes.
There you go. Okay, this is the proposed updates to public services, population, expanded funding. So this was the document that I'd kind of lost last time when we were on. So why don't I just, Sam, shall I just go through this quickly?
Yeah, Judith, fine. I've been working with this on the public services infrastructure chapter out of the plan. And I think that I may have some additional thoughts on this as I try to put the two pieces together, but I think this is a great start on it, and I'm comfortable with what's here at this point.
Okay. So this is the same format that we've used before. The original goals and recommendations to the left, and then just some proposed updates. And I think the proposed updates in red, and really what I went through this with Sam. What we were trying to do was just kind of tighten it up, but also make sure that we were reflecting kind of work in progress from 2020, which we've done in a number of areas. So for example, the capital planning committee, so that because, you know, we've been working on the plan for a couple of years, we didn't want to miss out on including some of the things that would have been in the original report, and then we can also say, hey, we've already delivered them, which will be a good start. So this is really just kind of wordsmithing. We've consolidated 3 of them again, just as we've done in other areas, just to kind of keep it very tight and focused. And I guess the thing just to obviously note here is that unlike the last report, the 2008 report, the big project in public services project was the public safety building, and obviously that's been delivered. So there isn't at this point an equivalent, but I know Sam's going to talk about a couple of things in the next part of this meeting, so I won't steal his thunder on that.
Go ahead, have at it. You know all the
No. And then there's a goal on population build out, just a couple of small recommendations there, and clarifying what do we mean by demographic diversity, that, you know, we recognize that we can't actually change who lives here per se. We can't kind of put up the barriers and say, no, you can't come into the community, but it was really just to make that link through into affordable housing.
Hey, Judith, I agree with that sentence, but I don't like affordable housing initiatives. I think it's enhanced population demographic diversity. It doesn't have to be affordable. It has to be a varying or a you know, besides what we have today. What I'm trying to say is, you know, maybe we can have some kind of unique duplexes that is not affordable, but maybe people don't want these big houses and stuff like that. I think it's with
diversity
housing initiatives, or I don't want to call it affordable because that to me sounds snobby.
Okay.
So that's the diversity of housing stock.
Yes, the diversity of housing.
We say diverse housing initiatives then?
Yeah. I just don't like the word affordable, because to me that says we have to have affordable housing if we have anybody of a different demographic as.
Yeah, no, okay, great point.
Yeah, I agree, Tom. Yep.
Just let me make a note so I don't forget to change that. And then expanded funding, again, this was just really to tighten up some of the recommendations. We did have a lot of recommendations. We really haven't looked at these little sections since probably way back last summer. So we've moved this one here around the Route 9 corridor to commercial diversity. We did that last time. And then just really, I just consolidated a couple of these recommendations. So it's a clear intent, but, you know, leaves the opportunity to come up with different options there around the funding. Everyone good with those? Very cool. Okay, I'll stop sharing.
So that was also the population build out and expanded funding mechanisms?
Yeah, and I think what my suggestion there, and I think Sam was in agreement, this because he was the original kind of lead on that whole section, was that we should incorporate, or we should merge those three sections or those three goals under public services, because one of the things that we'll talk about it when we look at the report drafts, but we need to kind of make sure that we're keeping to the kind of description of the sections in the plan. I mean, we can put what we want in the plan, but in order to comply with the state requirements, we have to have, you know, those sections. So to have another section, I think just didn't quite make sense because there's not that many points in there. So I think that's one of the things that Sam is working on, is how to merge all of this into his report section.
Good point, Judith. I think from state standpoint, we've got to have the sections covered to qualify for grant funding and having done the plan, but I think there's a lot of flexibility within that. So we could say the title of the section is X and talk about A, B, and C in the section. I don't think anybody's reading that carefully for it, as long as we can make the points that we think are important to have some place in the document. I mean, we ought to generally try to follow that outline, but I don't feel overly constrained by the titles on the things.
Yeah.
Okay. So then we'll move on to the chapters.
Oh, actually, can we just, I didn't put it in a note. Can we just get a quick update from Kate on the historical?
Oh, I'm sorry, Kate.
Yeah, so historical assets is part of the sense of community. So Ms. Kate has an update for us.
I spoke with Judith today too. We haven't had a meeting. We have a meeting tomorrow. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to review the information. We had a couple of people on the commission work on the goals and recommendations and made some good edits and changes. And like I said, hopefully we'll vote on that this week. If we're not able to vote on it, we'll at least have a significant discussion, hopefully, and be able to finalize that over the next meeting or two.
So I think that's kind of really good progress. When we went through, if you remember, you may not remember, but when we went through the outstanding recommendations from 2008, we really didn't know what the status were of some of the historic ones. I think because Rebecca had kind of been with us initially, but then dropped off the committee. And, you know, the section in the 2008 report was very long on historic assets, and there was a lot of very detailed references to all the things that you could do to kind of, you know, be on the historic register and grants and all the rest of it. And, you know, frankly, it was all a bit theoretical. So I, you know, just the first draft that I've seen from Kate, there's some very good recommendations that we're going to see, I think, very much in line with the idea of building the you know, the community engagement with what historic assets we've got, and you know, making that an important part of the culture of the community. So I think that's really good progress there.
Yeah, we focused, as Judith and I were talking about today with the commission, one of our big focuses has been on education. We do a bunch of programs with Woodward, with the Scouts. We have a sign program. So like everybody else has noticed on 2008 versus the update is trying to make them also more measurable. We're in the process of the National Historic District, and it's just a really long process. So that is in progress. So like I said, we'll continue to talk about it, but I think we're on the right track, and it shouldn't take us much longer to edit that and really give you a final draft.
Thank you, Kate.
Sure.
So was there anybody else? Or I cut anyone off?
I'll just do one for Shopsy. We had our meeting yesterday. A couple of quick, simple tweaks in some of the goals in the spreadsheet. We want to add a few more goals. One of them is around 40R. And also a couple of bullet items in the narrative. We're just going to re-wordsmith that a little bit. But like I said, minor changes that we discussed at our meeting on Monday.
Tom,
I can
do you-
update you.
I just had a question for Tom. So there was new legislation signed by the state that is going to require towns to set aside a district who have that have the T in the town, which I think Southborough is going to be one of those.
Oh, I didn't hear about that. I did not hear.
That's part of this housing choice bill that was passed recently, the economic development bill. And that district has to be near the transportation node, which would be near the T station down there. So we need to do something with our zoning bylaw to be compliant. And the state actually, I guess, is working with towns to figure out, you know, what that means and how long people have to get it done, et cetera, since that's got to be a town meeting. And so it's an interesting process and probably a lot of different ways to do it. So I think we need to collectively figure out what the best way to do that is.
That was going to be my question, if a 40R would qualify.
I don't know. I've not heard that conversation yet. So
I was fortunate to have a discussion with Philip DiMartino of DHCD on Friday. And we covered kind of a lot of ground, you know, under the umbrella of Shopsy. This is one of the initiatives that did come up. And so we talked about kind of the reduction in the 2/3 ratio needed for this type, you know, 40R accessory apartments and open space delineation has gone down from 2/3 vote to a simple majority at town meeting for the creation of, you know, so we were talking about that. He said there isn't any specific guidance at this time, but he did give me a contact person, Chris, who I'm gonna be in contact with. So there should be some more information kind of forthcoming.
and Sarah, just to clarify, that is correct. And that's for changing a zoning bylaw that encourages housing. And there's several pages worth of detail about exactly what that means. But today, for those folks who have not fought this out at town meeting historically, that typically for a zoning bylaw change requires 2/3 vote at town meeting.
Right.
And for certain sections now of the zoning bylaw, we can make changes with a majority vote, which is
Yes, sir.
actually going to, they think, open up some interesting housing opportunities. And in fact, it already seems to be moving in that direction in some communities where they've tried and fallen short of 2/3 but had a majority support. So there's some communities that are going to quickly take advantage of that. Again, we need to sort out what that means for us and how we want to do that, which is a separate issue from the requirement for by right housing near the transportation node. So, but if we come up with a plan, then presumably we can get a change approved by a majority vote at town meeting versus 2/3. So, but that's still again, as Sarah suggests, the state folks are scrambling to figure out exactly what that means and
Yes, sir.
the details of how you get it done. But again, I think ultimately it opens up some interesting possibilities, and I think that ought to be part of the plan, the master plan here, to point that out, that the rules have changed, and part of the challenge going forward is to figure out what we do about that and how we can use it to our advantage.
Mhm. There's something that Sarah forgot to mention. It's open space and recreation that needs a simple majority. So that swimming pool only needs 50.1% of the vote.
Excellent. I'm there. Okay, good.
So you have pull with the gov, huh, Tom?
Open space / recreation.
Is the governor a swimmer?
But I digress. Sorry.
Anything else?
Are we done?
I was just
No.
going to update in terms of open space and green initiatives. That what I've been doing is really looking at the 2008, and then updating the description. So I want to thank Kat for sending me a description in terms of trails, because that wasn't in existence in 2008. And Judith also sent me a description in terms of the Conservation Commission. And I know, Kristen, that you're working with the rec department, and we'll need to really look at the goals as it relates to the rec department for the open space and green initiatives. So essentially what I've done on Judith's recommendation, which I think was good, was to create that Word document based on 2008 and begin updates related to that. I think Judith is going to talk a little bit more about what level of detail do we need for the most current plan, because the previous plan had a very high level of detail as it related to open space, and some of that would need some additional research right now if we were going to give a similar level of detail in terms of things like exactly how much open space do we have, how much has been lost, statistics like that.
I actually want to talk to you guys about the resiliency section. That was the section that I had. So I noticed when I was looking at the agreed upon topics and action steps that it was also kind of in the same vein as the public services. So I split them up, and I transposed everything onto a document. It's nice and pretty and put together. And I talked to Judith about this. We don't have the hazard mitigation plan yet. Is that still correct?
Yeah, Melissa, I talked to Melissa Danza this week. She says it's not yet out there for kind of consumption yet.
Okay. I went through the summary of findings in the MVP, and I pulled out a few things that I didn't see were actually in the resiliency plan that we had in place. Not that there was one in 2008, the one that we had talked about during these meetings. And there were a few things that I added. I'm not sure if I should wait for the hazard mitigation plan to come out, and these could be potentially topics on that plan, and I can go from there, or if I should go about adding them into what I have here. Or if there's redundancy in what I've pulled out in any other part of the plan. Does that make any sense? So a few things were forest management, specifically fire risk management, which I think is probably going to be part of open space and trails and all of that. So I don't necessarily think that needs to also be mentioned here. The sewer system, the septic system, in town, I mean, could be a potentially, should one fail, I think that there's some wide-reaching implications as far as a failed septic system, or even multiple septic systems. I know I brought this up before, and there's Sam, you said there's pretty much a 0% chance of us going to town sewer, but in the summaries of the summary of findings, there were some other suggestions made as far as connecting to neighboring town systems, or specific package systems, or considering a town system. So I pulled that out as well. And then runoff water quality. I just mentioned that, in an effort to continue to preserve our environment and native species of plants, considering some of the following options may be appropriate. implementing some green building practices, parking lot upgrades, landscaping practice improvements, considering alternatives to road salt. And then again, I think that this kind of ties into public services, but identify at-risk populations like seniors, and maybe form some kind of a list in the event of some kind of sweeping emergency where we can easily get in touch with these people, let them know where shelter is, and what next steps are. Those are just a few things. I can go into it more in depth, but I was waiting for the hazard mitigation plan to come up before I went any further.
But hey, Mimi, can I make a comment about that?
You can do whatever you want, Sam.
Can I go
I was
to
waiting
bed?
for her to say no.
Gina, some good points there, and I think you hit on something that I've been struggling with. I went through the public facilities and services chapter from last time and started marking it up, and discovered a sizable list of shortcomings in my view on that one from last time. But one of the messages I get is that there is a lot of overlap in here.
Mhm.
And I've noted a number of places as I've gone through that I could connect to a variety of other areas. And I guess my current thinking is that as we go through those, we flag those things and we talk about them as if we were going to talk about them in our chapters. And when we get all those pieces, we can then sort of look at the overlaps and figure out what is the primary story location for that. And then the other sections can refer to it. So you get a series of cross references in here, which I think is the right kind of message, because most of these things are fairly tightly linked one to another. And so I think one of the strengths of the output from this process is the recognition that a lot of these things are tied together. You want to think about it more holistically than has been done in the prior version of it. And I don't feel bad at all about having a number of places where these things connect. And, this other section has the primary story for this particular item, but that affects what I'm working on in these ways in this one. So we need to continue to communicate going forward. So I think that rather than try to sort that out on the front end, my goal has been to tell what I think is the appropriate, fairly comprehensive story in the chapter I'm working on, and then we can compare notes when other folks do the same thing and see how it overlaps. And that creates a little extra work, but I think we get a much better picture that way in the end than trying to sort that out on the front end. And you don't have to talk to 6 other people right now to make progress on what you're doing either. And frankly, Gina, you may have ideas that I didn't think of in terms of what you're doing for things that affect what I'm doing and vice versa. So I think you get a little better stirring the pot that way. So that's sort of where I've been going. And I'm actually prepared. I didn't quite know what the plan was this evening, but I'm prepared to sort of work through my red line document, which has an awful lot of red line in it, as an example of what I've been finding. And I'd be curious, I guess, to know what other people are finding in here. I may be way out in left field, and I'd like to know that before I keep working on it. But maybe others have better ideas in terms of how to approach it than what I've been doing. So I would think that would be valuable for at least 1 or 2 of us to work through, at least at a high level, and sort of share screen and show, here's the kind of things that I got a list of, 6 or 8 points that I think are sort of major themes out of what I've been finding, and then flip through the document to say, here are the kind of things that I want to update these examples, and I want to redraft this stuff, and I want to add pieces here and there, et cetera, so folks can get at least a conceptual idea of what I've been doing, and then be able to say, whoops, you're on the wrong track, or that sounds like that's the right way, and that's sort of what I've been doing, et cetera, so that I would find that pretty helpful unless folks have a better suggestion.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. So what I did when I was drafting the document, I use my best judgment as to, where do I think this fits? And I would go into the Google Drive and look at that particular page. Judith, you sorted it out perfectly. I was able to find, search for keywords and find different things in different documents. So I did find, a significant amount of overlap, which is why the resiliency section is actually super short. It's really just 2 main points and then some action steps thereafter. And then I went through the summary of findings and, like I said, pulled out a few more things that I didn't necessarily find in other areas of, things that people are working on. That doesn't mean like I went through everything with a fine-tooth comb and this is like, these are definitively the holes that we have. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that there are a lot of intermingled portions of this plan, and a reference in a main section to a different section of how these things interconnect, I think is probably a really good idea.
Okay.
And I think that, just to echo that, I've been looking at what we call sense of community is actually in the kind of official section description is something like natural resources, historic and culture.
Mhm.
And there's clearly an overlap there on the natural resources side with some of the pieces that we've got in open space and environment. So I think Karen and I said we'd probably kind of compare our sections on that as well. I think it's a really good approach, Sam, to have the references and the linkages. I think the only thing we just want to make sure that we're careful about is having a specific recommendation only in one section, because one of the shortcomings of the 2008 plan was they put the same recommendation but with different references in multiple places. So it looked as though you had 5 or 6 unique recommendations, and they were actually only 2 recommendations. So that and then I think what then happened was different groups thought they had responsibility for those recommendations. So you had more than one group actually working on them. So, but I think, with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, particularly around, I think sidewalks, where we did agree that we'd put it in more than one. We put a recommendation in more than one place because they were quite, specific to creating the holistic picture. We've got unique, goals and recommendations out there this time. So I think I don't think that's going to be a big problem for us.
Would it make sense? I know this may, we may be too far down the line. Do we have to have sections in this document, or can we just list our goals? Do you know what I mean? Rather than have this section and this section and this section and this section, because there is so much overlap, and there's obviously going to be quite a bit of shared responsibility between different departments and different commissions. Would it make sense to just list the goals, and then maybe within that goal list the actual committees responsible? Does that make sense? Or list like a...
Well, that's what we'll build out once we've got the goals and recommendations, and we're working on the narrative. The next kind of deliverable that we can start to create is the implementation plan, which is where we will have much more of a, here's the list of goals and recommendations, and who is then going to be the primary person or group responsible. So again, a key thing that I think we agreed early on was that there will be one primary group responsible for each recommendation, because as soon as you start having more than one group responsible for it, everyone just kind of goes, well, it's not me. So it'll be whoever ends up being the primary group responsible, to then say, okay, but we need to partner with this group or that group. So Karen might say, well, this is an open space, this is an open space commission main responsibility, but they clearly need input from the Conservation Commission, and they probably need input from the recreation group as well. But that becomes the art of implementation.
Okay.
So,
I'm not sure.
I just want to say, I think that's a really important discussion, because I know we even found the Rec Commission on our first pass, and Judith, I think I spoke with you or Mimi about this. We found ourselves doing this when we were setting goals. We're like, well, that's not something the commission would do. But then we stopped ourselves and said, well, wait a second, this isn't the Recreation Commission section. This is recreation. And while not all things there we think would fall under the commission's, certainly as a community, it's important. And so we, reset our thinking that way. But definitely that just underscored to us the importance to be like, well, make sure we all know what we're signing up for and agree on that ownership to drive it forward.
A good point, Kristen. I think that one of the shortcomings I saw from the prior plan was that it was too insular, siloed, and that I think there's value from all of us sort of thinking more broadly about the function, if you will. And then at the end of the process, if we get implementation activities or strategies or whatever, we can step back and take a look at who does it make sense to do this, depending on individual committee scopes and responsibilities and so on and so forth. I'd rather have the right answer as opposed to being driven to an answer that fits within our organizational structure and may not be exactly the right answer. So can I back up a second, Gina? I want to be sure I understood your question about how we organize this. I think that we got a lot of flexibility to organize the goals and strategies and implementation ideas and so on and so forth. But just to reinforce, I think we are constrained by the state requirements for
that's what I was asking.
chapter lists. And again, I don't feel compelled to hold to that tightly as long as we got the right titles on the chapters. And then we got flexibility beyond that to organize as we see fit or makes sense from an implementation standpoint. But I don't think we can consider everything in a different structure from a book standpoint or publication standpoint without risking getting in trouble with the state on it and not meeting their requirements. So it's sort of, you said it doesn't make sense, and that's the definition of state requirements sometimes. That's what we got to deal with here, at least keep it in mind and make an effort to be consistent there. So
Gotcha. Yeah, that was my question. I just didn't know if there was some kind of binding, reason we had to actually format this document in like the way that the 2008 one was.
State law gives an outline for the end of the 10-year update of the plan.
Okay.
And I don't know if they're not going to give us any money if we don't do that, but it generally makes sense to follow what they ask and then argue later. So
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense.
And I also just remember back to, we kind of started with a process way back almost 2 years ago, where we took the 2008 plan and we tried to decide by committee to committee what had already been accomplished and what hadn't and what was still important. And we did this whole kind of brainstorming around what were going to be the most important priorities for this 2020 plan. And it was through that whole kind of brainstorming process that we created these categories of focus. And so the categories of focus are not necessarily just mirroring the 2008 plan, based on what I remember anyway. It was mirroring kind of our whole group process around what everybody in each committee felt was most important to focus on for 2020. And that's where those categories kind of came from.
Right, yeah.
And that's a really good point that, so even though, I'll use sense of community as the example, there isn't a community section within the state structure, but we said it was a very, it really is a signature element for us. And I
Clear
think
theme.
one of the things I'm starting to kind of work through is how do you create that theming, if you like. That's not a very good word, but how do you create that narrative and that storyboard around that within that, the overall section. And another good example there is the environment. There are 2 paragraphs in the 2008 report about the environment, and we have, I think, 5 different goals and recommendations because we felt it was so important to kind of, embrace that and incorporate that into this next plan. So, sense of community, environment, accessibility and connectivity it's not a section. It's called something like transport, transit, and circulation. It's like, ooh, how exciting. But when you start to create the narrative around this theme of improved accessibility and connectivity, it really starts to bring it to life. And that's what I think we've got such a great kind of baseline to work with based on all that work, as Karen said, that we did a couple of years ago.
And it was a whole kind of process around really starting to look at what was done in 2008 and what was really important to us now, and then what came out of the visioning meeting, and it was through all of that kind of data input that we created the categories that we currently have. Not to say that they can't change or that they're, you know, in stone, but I wouldn't want anyone to think that they just came from the 2008 plan, because there was kind of a lot of process that went between 2008 and where we are now.
Yeah. And to Sam's
Karen,
point, you can have a section heading, you know, you have a section heading on what you put into it. And I'll show you when I show you one of my sections, how I've started to kind of get around that little.
Karen, you actually touched on a good point. And I'm sorry, I have not gone back through the 2008 plan and on open space and rec. Judith provided it to me again, just to refresh my memory. Is there a section in the overall plan where we are recapping what's been done since the 2008 plan?
Well, yes. So when we yes and yes. When we look at yes and yes. So when we the original, I think we called it the storyboard, the original storyboard that I kind of proposed, and I think we all agreed to in principle at the end of last year, had a section which described the process that we'd gone through, and had some highlights in it in terms of what came out of the vision forum and what came out of the vision survey. Actually, the MAPC people did some work on that for us, and we also had within that some information around, well, what was the kind of the current status of the 2008 plan. But what we said was we didn't want to really overly focus on that. So I think there's definitely, it's important to have some content around, well, what did we achieve, what did we not achieve? But certainly what I'm finding as I start to write or to edit out the two sections I've got, which is accessibility, connectivity, and sense of community, is I think there's a real opportunity to incorporate into the narrative what's been achieved without making it like a really lengthy process. So, for example, on sense of community, the historic assets, that's what we were just talking about with Kate. You know, Kate's going to talk to the commission about, well, what do you feel you've actually achieved around the management of historic assets in the last decade? Mm-hmm. So I think if you look at what was laid out as the recommendations and the opportunities in that 2008 plan, there is a whole document that I'll repost that said, well, which recommendations did we complete and which didn't we start? What was the status of them?
Judith?
Rather than going into, the 107 specific lines, there's a really good opportunity to be able to summarize it and say, well, here's the 4 or 5 things that REC have done in the last decade. And
I gotcha.
Judith, a good example on the facilities thing, big push from the last time was the police. In the facility summary, I've redrafted that to point out that we have built a public safety complex. And in fact, that dealt with one of the substantial issues from the last time around. So that has been updated since the last version of the plan. So versus going through a checklist kind of thing,
right.
those things are identified. And as we've made progress, I've tried to include some of that text in the descriptive material. So that's not the only way to do it, but I think that's not a bad way to punch the list here.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Plus, I think in some cases, we'll find there are things that have been achieved that were never even intended to be achieved. See what I mean? It's like, there are things that happen that have moved forward that were success recommendations. So, the whole trails kind of committee and the work that they've been doing, I think I found, a couple of small references to it, but, setting up the trails committee and all the work that they've done there is something that we said, well, that's on top of what was, asked for in 2008.
Yeah.
So I'm sure we can look around and say, well, let's make sure we include those things, because it's all, it's all good stuff. It's all good stuff.
And it doesn't help us to point out that a relatively small share of the objectives from 2008 have actually been done. So there have been some
Yeah.
important ones, but I'd rather focus on going forward than what we didn't do historically.
No,
Well,
that makes perfect sense.
I think part of the reason for that, and my chapter was land use, and I started going through and trying to update that. And I think one of the sole goals of the 2008 master plan was to completely revamp all the zoning. So there's tons of goals and recommendations on that. But I don't think this committee wants to go back there again. So there's like big sections of that that are going to be redlined.
Yeah. And in fact, I think we actually said, and Mimi, didn't we, when we went through that some of those outstanding recommendations, that we said that, recommendations on zoning would be specific to individual projects. So there's, reference to zoning on the downtown initiative, because that is so fundamental to kind of, that overall program. But there's not anywhere that says, oh, here's the 20 bits of zoning that we want to get updated. So
Right. Yeah, so I thought we were going to look at zoning more organically and set our goals, and then if from there one of the recommendations was some zoning change, then that's where it would come in. So do we want to look at any of these red line documents, or we want to keep working on them until they're
I think
more
we should
ready for prime time? Or
I want to see
Do
that.
a couple of them, yeah.
and I had one question on mine. I thought that the well, at least the chapter I was looking at was very wordy, more novelesque than like a working plan. Do we want to?
This is one of the things that Judith and I talked about today too on the phone, that maybe we want to create a kind of more simplified standard for each of our chapters. I think one of the risks of going back to the 2008 template, well, it's great to reflect back on it, is it was so verbose in all chapters, and there was so much detail. And I wouldn't want us to think we need to emulate that same level of detail. At least I wouldn't want to for the chapter that I'm working on right now.
Yeah,
I
Karen,
think to be more focused and simple would be better.
yeah, my description was the word filler. As one who spent many years doing this kind of thing, and
I was being nice, Sam.
making a pretty good buck off of it, and I think that my impression was that they went out and sort of hoovered up information that they could find, and stuff that was easy to find. Great, we'll grab it all and we'll dump it in here. We got pages worth of description of the town's water system.
Yeah.
That I'm working with, and there's basically not much going on there that you couldn't capture in, less than a page. And so I think it's not bad context, and I think there's a lot of good stuff in the entire document, including the chapter I'm working on. But I think you're right; it can be simplified, streamlined, and just pick out the salient facts. And if something is in good shape, you can say things are in good shape here, and here are a couple of things that we need to keep an eye on, etc. But I'm not certainly compelled to, replicate the number of words here. But yet, the consulting world likes to measure success by page count. So you go out and stack up a huge amount of
I
stuff.
wonder if we could create a kind of, I don't know, like framework or template might help us simplify things. Something that came to mind to me as I was looking at my chapter was sort of what's been accomplished. What are the key accomplishments since 2008? What's the primary focus for the 2020, 2021 plan? and then the goals, pasting in the goals. Or even in the open space and green initiatives, there was a little blurb about each of the organizations that helps to contribute to open space and green initiatives. And I thought that was useful, but to know these are the people that are really focusing in on it. But some of the other kind of data stuff that was almost like a State of the Union address, on Southborough for all things open space and recreation, I wasn't sure if that was really the purpose of a master plan.
Well, I find some of that useful, Karen, though. I mean, on the facilities thing, I think it is useful to, list the buildings that the town owns, for example.
Yeah.
So a reader who's not as familiar with all of this stuff as many of us are who have been involved with it for a number of years has some sense of context that, a person, again, who's just moved to town happens to stumble on this for some bizarre reason, to read the plan.
Yeah.
But and for open space as well, in terms of some catalog of, here are the open space parcels.
But I've got to be honest. I mean, I'm on the Open Space and Preservation Commission, but I don't have a current list of all the open space that Southborough currently owns, or the open space that's been lost since 2008. And I would love to have those statistics, but I don't even know where to go for them.
Yeah. Lisa Braccio just recently did a survey of town-owned property that didn't include all the open space because the town doesn't own all the open
Most
space
of it.
that is owned by other entities.
Yeah, I know I've seen it before. It's been a while, but I know in rec before we've had, and it might have been Bonnie that brought it to us, I think, if I really think back. Sam, you were probably there. I remember her laying something out and very clearly being able to show us, because of course, it's an interest of rec to know, not that we're thinking of buying any property for fields or anything, but it's a relevant thing for us to know. So someone has that information. I don't know who. Like I said, I think it was Bonnie that came and kind of passed it off to us as her final act.
Karen makes a good point.
As Board of Selectmen member.
Yeah. It's,
Karen makes a good point.
I like seeing it listed, but I wasn't sure where to find it, the most current information.
And maybe,
Sure
I put some placeholders in what I'm working on for things that I don't have now, so maybe we can't get them. But I think, Karen, you make a good point that we don't want to go overboard with that. Somewhere, I think there's a balance between sufficient detail so people have a good sense of context and listing, every hammer and nail that we own, for example. Obviously, I can't.
And I just want to second Karen's suggestion on some level of standardization for format, so the document itself is consistent versus kind of different writing styles. And obviously, Karen, our section or chapter especially has to somewhat line up.
For sure.
Good to the extent that we could do it with other chapters. I know it's going to be a little different because kind of different focus areas call for different sections perhaps, but I second that idea. And then I also really like the idea, Karen, rec partners with a ton of people, and it's not really well known. I mean, we've had people come to meetings suggesting that we partner with certain agencies that they're already partnered with and have been for a while. So I think that's something that I'll take back to the rec commission, because I think it's a really good idea to be like, look, we have all these relationships coming into town and supporting our recreation programs in some way, shape, or form. And maybe it's an appendix, I don't know, but I think it's worthwhile because we've had stuff brought to even the floor of town meeting before saying, why aren't you doing this, when in fact they already are.
So why don't I give I'll have a first go at a template. I mean, just to, not a big detailed one, but just to say, here's what I think, because I think Sam and I have talked as well. I think what we found is kind of similar. What he's found is similar to what I found, and so why don't I send that round? Can I send that?
Sounds great.
Mimi, can I send that round? Open meeting law, all that kind of stuff.
Just a template?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just a template. Yeah. And I think to the point about the data, so, charts, graphs, maps, I deliberately didn't start trying to update anything because I did it for the first one, and even though I could potentially find some references online, I thought this is going to take me way too long to do it. So I've just put in little notes and comments and placeholders. But I do think,
Yeah.
another observation I would have based on the 2008 report is that, as well as it being particularly fluffy in certain parts, is that there was data that was put out there that had no reference back into the goals and recommendations. And I think that's something we have talked about before, is that if we're going to include data, whether it's maps or charts or graphs, it really needs to be meaningful in terms of, well, we've looked at this and it's telling us this, and therefore that's why we created this theme and these goals and recommendations. It's not, particularly, I think one of the things I think we'll see is that there's not been a huge amount of changes in a lot of data,
No.
The land probably isn't that.
I was even thinking of, referencing current websites. So one of the things I started doing in our chapter with the different paragraphs that were of different organizations, like, like SOLF or the Trails Committee, was I opened up their current website and I tried to copy and paste little blurbs from their website. And then I thought, well, I can do this, but wouldn't it make sense to just have references to these different organizations' websites in the master plan? So if people want to look at the most current stuff related to it, they can, but that we wouldn't, assume that what we put in the master plan is going to stay current for much more than a year or so in terms of that data, the data about each of the organizations. But the website should be updated.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point.
Yeah, and I think since everything's going digital, obviously the master plan will be posted, digitally and live. And so those links could be live, as long as the master plan, once it's completed, is up, and accessible. So that's really great.
Good.
So Sam, were you going to share what you've...
I thought Judith had volunteered, but I'm happy to. Judith
she volunteered you.
I'm happy to take a whack at it. So,
but it's interesting. It sounds like we're all kind of doing the same thing and are coming to the same conclusion. So that's positive.
So I guess what I propose to do is to share my screen and flip through the document. Judith, while you were offline here, I got volunteered to do the facilities and services thing. Good planning.
No. Well, I will show mine as well. I just had somebody, my lovely other half upstairs with the TV blaring. I couldn't turn it down.
Is the hockey game on? That's what I want to know.
I don't know what he's watching. It's
so should I go ahead?
Sure.
Okay. I will share screen. What I'm going to do is just to go to the Word document that I've been redlining. And I've got some summary points at the beginning. As I've gone through, I picked up some things that I think are notable that I haven't developed fully, but points that have occurred to me as I've reviewed what happened in 2008 in the context of what we've been doing recently here. So here goes. Let me see if I can find this here. No, I'm in trouble finding the right window here.
Too much open, Sam.
Excuse me?
You got too much open.
I do. I don't know how to fix this. Judith, why don't you go ahead while I try to figure out how to fix this.
All right, hang on a sec.
That was real smooth, Sam. Real good job you did there.
That was smooth. I was impressed. Yeah.
Techno incompetent here.
Right. Let me just. I'll show you. Okay. Can everyone see this?
Mhm.
Okay. Let me see if I can make it a little bit bigger. Can you get a bit bigger? Okay. So I'll just run through it and talk about some of the things that I found and some of what I've been doing just to give you a sense. So this is it's called circulation and transportation, although it's basically our accessibility and connectivity. So one of the things I did is we have objective statements attached to all of our goals and recommendations. So improve accessibility and connectivity across the town is the objective statement for this. So that's one of the things I did, was just to put that almost as like a, you know, a little banner headline underneath the section so that it hits you at the beginning of the section that, well, this is what we're really talking about. That's that overriding theme. Okay. So you can see from the amount, so this is tracked, the document is tracked. So basically everything that it's mainly deletes. Everything that I've taken out, we still have a record of, so you can see it. The only thing I did is I accepted all of the formatting, which I'm hopefully won't teach you to suck eggs here, but if I just do that, you can see that if it's just a little formatting change, I just accepted all of those, so you don't end up with this huge list of things. But you can see for each of these, if I expand out, just how much was actually taken out. Okay, so as we talked about before, I've lost me R now. One of the things that the approach I took with this was to start by editing out 2008 rather than trying to go along and edit and then add stuff as well. So this is to create the baseline. So what I did is really try to summarize what we had. And then as I've gone through, I've made notes. You can add a comment here. Oops, here we go. So for example, there was a reference in the transportation around the potential of impact of other towns' master plans. So I just took out all of the fluff and left the key bullet points there. And then my note says, we need to research the status of these plans, decide if they've impacted Southborough, and look at the current plans that are actually out there for the town. So stuff that still needs to be done, I've included in this version of the document as little notes. Okay. And that's really what I've done you can see from all of these deletes, you know, some places I've got something like, it says check, where I just made a note that we need to check stuff out. There's a number of these, you know, stuff like the arc of innovation and TIP. Again, I don't know whether these still exist, but rather than spend time researching them, I've just put a little note and said, well, let's just go in and see if anything is still meaningful. So the way that this section has worked is there's a kind of a regional context. There's then a description of the current transit and transport network, which is again very reduced down. And then there's a couple of data sets, and this is where this is a good example of journey to work data. Now in 2008, the reason that data was used was to highlight the fact that there's other people that people are leaving the town and need access onto the main highways. as we look at the new data, and this is from the census data in 2000, so we're only going to be able to go to 2010 anyway, we might decide that it's just not even worth putting it in here because it's not really telling us anything that's going to lead to our recommendations. And that is actually quite an important point to know, is that because of the timing on this, it would be great to use 2020 census data, but obviously that's not going to be available because they haven't even closed the census at this point, I think. So we are going to be, 10 years behind when we use that data, but it is what it is on that one. So all of this, again, lots of deletes, lots of summarizing. And in some cases, let me say, okay. In some cases, what I've done just to try and make it simple is I've actually made assumptions about what the story is. So I've just said here, I've just literally made it up, but put a note to validate it. The growth of traffic on local networks has continued with no material change. I have no idea if that's the case or not, but at least then I've got something that I can work with and go back and edit. And again, all of this just needs to be validated. We've got something on bicycles, sidewalks, and trails. But here's a good example where we've got trails in the open space plan section now. So that's a great example of where we'll cross-reference. There's something on complete streets, but this was a very small little reference, and we've got a lot more that we can do there. And then, so it talks about regional context, the current state, and within that current state, we'll talk about what's been achieved, and then future conditions. And then we also need to add in something on individual accessibility. Okay. And again, I've just put a note to do that. So what I then did is just literally cut and pasted in the goals and then listed out all of the recommendations that we've already got. So that bit's pretty easy. The bit that I've got a big placeholder for here is this idea of themes, because in 2008, what I felt was there was this real gap between all of the narrative and the data and the goals and recommendations, and there wasn't something that pulled out and said, oh, here's the key. I've just used the word themes because I can't think of a better word, but here's the key themes, here's the key messages that we take from all of this. And this is why we've got the goals and recommendations that we've come up with. Okay. So that's basically as far as I've got. It's actually gone down from, I think, if I look at the no tracking. No, my tracking's come off it. It's gone down from something like 34 pages, and it's now down to 12, and that's with all of the recommendations in there. So I'd say, in the two sections I've done, definitely going to be 50 to 60% less because there's not the fluff in there. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of the first pattern. It's same with sense of community. Sense of community is definitely, there's more. I've been a lot tougher, if you like. I think Sam used the word surgical. I just took a scalpel to huge amounts of it and just went because one, it's fluff, and two, it already exists in 2008. So if someone wants to know how do you get a property onto the National Historic Register, just go back to 2008 because we've still got that report. And I think that's one of the things that we can do within the the introduction to the main report, and if necessary in each section, is kind of highlight the fact that the 2008 report was the big comprehensive first view of the master plan for Southborough, and this is an update to that plan, but with much more focus on, you know, meaningful goals and recommendations for going forward. But I do think there's definitely an opportunity in the sense of community section to add more in there in the narrative in terms of, well, what's now going on in Southborough, because there's really not very much. Was, you know, there were a couple of references to the Arts Centre and that's pretty much it. But I think there's a, you know, big opportunity for us to kind of talk about, well, what's already going on in terms of, so for example, there's nothing about the library and the fact what the library does and the fact that the library now has this 5-year strategic plan. Well, that's a great, you know, new thing to add in. So that's just going to take a bit more time to work on. But
So Catherine, Judith, couple of questions. I'm looking at the section that you forward to me and the housing. So pretty much you kept the, as I call them, the paragraphs or the section heads, you know, like the introduction and you know, your next section. You pretty much kept those. Got rid of them.
That's it. That's the 2008 plan. There's nothing's been edited on that yet.
No, but the one that you just showed us, is that
Oh yeah,
working document for the 2021?
the one I just showed you is this is accessibility.
But it's for the current master plan, is what I'm saying.
Yes.
I don't want to recreate the wheel, I guess. So you took the 2008, gutted it.
2008, and basically the first thing I did was take a scalpel to it and cut it all down.
Okay.
So you can see from here how much
So
actually took out.
introduction, you plan on keeping introduction, regional context, you know, if you scroll down. You
Yeah,
plan-
but very much shorter.
Okay.
Very much shorter. And some of it will probably end up coming out because, you know, it's just not relevant anymore. So this was my first pass, just because some of it, particularly on the transport transit, there are some things in there. There's some sections in there where I think work has been done, and I want to be able to use that as a kind of a hook to be able to say, well, this is what's been done in them.
Mm-hmm. Judith, did I hear you say you were going to do a template, suggested template for all of us to consider for the various sections?
Yeah.
There that would look
Yeah.
something like the 2008 plan, but maybe with some updates.
Yeah.
So more to come on that one then. Okay.
Yeah. And I can show you just quickly, just so that we've got it, just so everyone sees it. This is. So this is what sense of community looks like. So, you know, very similar. Let me just take that out. Very similar, lots and lots of deletes. Probably more deletes here than in the other.
I don't see a document. You've got to.
Oh, sorry.
Google the OneDrive thing up there.
Hang on. Can you see it now?
Yep, there it is.
Yeah. So again, you can see an awful lot of editing and redlining and just stuff. But here, you know, here's a really good example. We were talking about environment and management challenges, so important to us. And, you know, this is the only things that were referenced. You know, there was a reference to creosote railroad ties, which I think probably not that important, but maybe they were. And you can certainly see on the historical side just how much stuff, all of that you can see scrolling on the left-hand side has all been taken out.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, lot of scalpeling. Oh, here's a question for anybody. The Southborough Players, do they still exist? Anybody
No,
know? No?
they're gone. Yeah.
Okay. I put this down. That's a great example. Well, that's 3 paragraphs that can come out.
Game over, huh?
What was the Southborough Players while you mentioning it?
It
Theater
was
group?
a theater group.
Yeah, theatre group, yeah.
So cool. Like similarly, I have a paragraph on SWAMP, SWAMP, an acronym, and I talked to Mimi to try to figure out if that still existed. So there's things like that we need to take out.
Yeah. And, you know, here's a perfect example in sense of community. You know, there was a whole pages and pages about all of these bylaws and districts and preservation. I just left it in here because I might steal a couple of bits from it on my themes. But, you know, here's another example of all of this can just come out because
But we did adopt the demolition delay bylaw.
we did. No, we didn't. According to the plan, it got turned down in 2003. Did we go back and do it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We have it now.
Oh, well, there you go. But that is a good example of, you know, you don't need a paragraph that explains what the demolition delay bylaw actually does and how you use it. You just say it's been implemented. So there you go. Work today. Did you find anything, Sam?
Yeah, I'm going to Plan B here. I just sent this document to Kat, who volunteered to pull it up and show it on her screen since I'm having trouble with it. So it's zooming through the etherwaves in North Korea now, headed toward Southborough again. I'll try this. There you go. Okay, good. Perfect. Thank you, Kat. Very helpful. So if you could just start scrolling to the next page where there's some summary points. There you go. Great. Thanks. The issue for me is that the view of infrastructure I thought was far too narrow since it focused solely on physical infrastructure. And I think that there are some other important aspects like the technology infrastructure and the transportation infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's worth some sort of language statement that reinforces that we're taking a much broader view of infrastructure, much of which will flow over into other parts of the plan. But I think that's an important concept to reinforce as we think about this. I think there's too much filler, as we've already talked about, and we only want to retain some of that. So I strongly endorse Judith's approach with the active scalpel here. I think it's critical to add a section on technology infrastructure. The Technology Committee has been doing some great work. They're working to finalize a strategic plan that has some excellent stuff in it that I think we need to reinforce, because for me at least, going forward, given the rapid advance of technology and likely continued rapid advance of technology, I think the informational infrastructure, the technology infrastructure is going to become proportionally far more important over the next decade or two than physical assets have been historically. And I think it's important for us to recognize that and reinforce the value that we can get from supporting that. The schools piece in the 2008 plan was simply a rendition of the buildings that we have and some student population projections. And again, I think the schools, the educational aspect for me is another, at least conceptual part of infrastructure that is important to support and expand in town. And schools, as we'll hear from Keturah, have been working on a strategic plan that I think, again, we need to have a strong place for in here to pull some of those ideas in. And all of this actually, in many ways, also overlaps into the sense of community part of the world, because it seems to me that a variety of components here reinforce sense of community, whether it's the schools, whether it's the technology stuff, whether it's the accessibility to trails and recreation facilities and programs and so forth. All of that to me reinforce opportunities for individuals to connect with other people in town in a variety of ways. Libraries, another great example that sort of stirs the pot. And if we have enough of those sort of cross-functional things working, then the chances that individuals are going to find multiple ways to connect with other residents in town and establish relationships with people, which I think drives the sense of community, the better off we are. And so I think, again, all this overlap doesn't hurt, but I want to be sure we capture the key components in these various sections. Library is another one, again, that talks about the building, but I think we ought to add programmatic influence as part of the infrastructure view. Rec, we've talked about some as well, and open space, again, not only physical, but programmatic infrastructure, which I think is a broader concept than they talked about in 2008. Reinforcing the progress that we've made on capital planning and the opportunity that the capital planning committee is going to have going forward to help coordinate planning around infrastructure investment, I think is a strong point to make. We need to include ADA accessibility considerations in this as well, which again is certainly a function of infrastructure, whether it's physical or things like technology, for example. And I don't know that, again, we need to develop a comprehensive set of plans for all these things, but I think we're going to have placeholders at the very least and some ideas about how we can reinforce these things. Let's see.
Sam, as you may know, the self-evaluation for the ADA committee was started last week and will be available in June. It covers an extremely broad range of things in town. By June, we will certainly have a list of those things that probably require some attention and may very well want to be included in something like this.
Okay, and maybe if as that goes along, if you can, Bill, sort of filter in any sort of predictions, directional input in terms of how that's going and some of the big issues that seem to be percolating there. The earlier we can get that in here, the better off we are. So that'd be very helpful.
Will do.
My final point is as I ground through this stuff, I kept sort of thinking in the back of my mind, how is this going to fit with the current set of goals and strategies that we've developed? And is it all going to sort of meet in the middle here? And I was increasingly worried that it wasn't going to, and sure enough, it didn't quite. And so I've still got some work to do to reconnect the goals that you'll see in a minute here that I've pasted in at the end. But I think that that's, again, a doable task. I just haven't gotten far enough with it to go back and sort of reconnect, as opposed to working through here and thinking about updates to the text that came from 2008 plan and pieces that either needed to be updated or needed to be removed, et cetera. So Judith is farther along in this process than I am, but I think we're headed in the same direction, is to make it all fit. So Kat, let's start scrolling through a little bit so you can see what I did, but it's the same kind of thing that Judith did in terms of I've done a little bit of rewriting here and there. And if you, let's keep going. If you find a comment in here and double click on it, it opens up the panel on the left side. That there we go. You can see that, well, I don't know how you show the left side. If I double click on mine, it shows the comments. But anyway, it's a similar thing. There's stuff that's added on the left panel and updated, need to update charts, for example, in here. Let's keep scrolling here. I've done some editing in here. And one of the big things, as I mentioned previously, the public safety building was a big issue, public safety facilities in 2008. We've updated that, so we need to have new text that I can track down to describe what we did with that in hopefully a fairly succinct way. Let's keep going. Again, edits, deletes, removals, et cetera in here. So this is, again, sort of first pass through doing more or less the same kind of thing that Judith did. Hold on there a second, please, Kat, back up a little bit. One of the things that the public works thing, again, was extraordinarily limited last time around. I think we ought to think about roadways, sidewalks, trails, open space, again, is all part of the public infrastructure here in ways that, again, will overlap with other sections. But I think we need to make the point that all of that I see is sort of public structures, infrastructure, whatever you want to call it, that is an important part of the planning process, an important part of the community going forward that we want to consider from a variety of different perspectives. I've noted the municipal technology infrastructure, again, MTC strategic plan. We've got a very strong group there doing some great work in terms of planning that, again, I look to build the groundwork for how we think about collecting information, sharing information, communicating throughout the town, which we've made great strides over the last few years in some of this stuff. But if you sort of go back 10 years or 15 years and think about what technology was at that point, the internet was in its infancy, basically, in terms of widespread public use. And it's hard to extrapolate what it's going to be another 10 or 15 years, but I think we need to be working hard to think ahead of that, take advantage of it to reinforce the things that we want to push for in the town. Let's keep going a little bit more. Here's the schools piece again, which I think not only facilities, but programmatic issues. The schools are talking about cradle to grave education, which clearly we can't afford to do today, but going forward, we need to think about that, because I see that again as another piece of sense of community activity. It's a great melting pot for all sorts of interests and individuals in town. And I think we need to think more globally about that as well. So this is a piece that's going to, again, I think, get substantially augmented out of the strategic plans in the schools, and I think be much more important in the plan than it was 10 years ago. Let's keep scrolling, please. Updated charts for population, which is interesting. They just did a student population study. They've hired consultants to look at that as they're thinking about how many schools they need, and Katura can update us on that. The bottom line was that it looked like the population was not going to grow substantially, school population, over the next 10 years or so, although they're still sorting out some details on that. And the big question mark remains Park Central on that one as the trial continues last week, this week, et cetera. So it's going to be interesting to see how that one turns out. And that obviously can have a significant impact on school population. But so it's, again, still TBD. Let's keep going here. Here's the public water supply. This is about 5 pages too long, I think. So we can refer back to the 2008 plan for the details. And we're blessed with a connection to the MWRA, and that's sort of the bottom line on the story. Keep scrolling. I think this data was included simply because it was available from DPW. So easy to collect a lot of data. There's recreation facilities. Again, this is the link to the recreation plan. And I think, Kristen, an important part of this is the programmatic side, which may be a stretch to think of that as infrastructure, but I guess I'm very comfortable talking about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, programming, we've certainly talked about when we reviewed goals. It wasn't just for the master plan, it was also, Tim has a very specified set of goals, more near term, that I would say relate more to programming. When I think about, 5-10 years out, we could have something generic to say, we want to maintain our evolving program. I mean, they're very much on the beat of what's changing and evolving. I mean, we used to joke about, just as an example, a few years back, we used to joke a little bit about pickleball, but now pickleball is like is a very hot topic. And Tim has adjusted, right? And he's made it so that that's been incorporated. So I feel like programming is a little bit more reactionary to what's happening in culture. And Tim set up the program so far to be, for example, E-League. Part of the reason I've been on video tonight is because my son's participating in an E-League, which is an electronic league, and he's doing horribly. So every Monday and Wednesday, there's tears and confusion, and it's not E-League's fault. But so I think I can bring that back to the commission. But aside from having something from, like, just thinking off the top of my head, having something generic, as in we will strive to maintain, programs that will meet the changing needs of our culture. I feel like anything that we ever recognize as a program need, we'd hop on very quickly. So whether or not we have like a 5-10 year goal out for programming other than doing what they're doing today, and that's being very adaptive, that's the question mark in my head, but I'll bring that back to the rec commission.
And Kristen, I'm not suggesting that we include great detail. I guess my sort of not fully formed concept here is that I think there's an important role in this particular chapter to push the idea that infrastructure is not just physical bricks and mortar. And it includes things like programming, e.g. recreational programming by the rec department is an important infrastructure piece. P.S. The rec plan for additional information about how rec views that particular infrastructure component. And then rec can write, language like you're suggesting, which I think makes great sense, that, we're going to keep our, ear to the ground in terms of what the public is looking for and be prepared to respond quickly to provide programming to entertain and educate the public, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, so I think
actually, the one other thing I'll add is, from a capital standpoint, so there's never any surprises, because sometimes it seems like it is, like there is some additional capital. There's capital needed above and beyond facilities such as transportation, which certainly, as opportunities grow and other facilities, or as we look to engage with other towns, that becomes a consideration. So your point is well taken, and we'll incorporate that. And I'll discuss that, obviously.
And again, capital is great, because I think of capital as a place that could play here in terms of technology investment. So clearly, you talk about the E-League, that's a place maybe the town thinks about investing technology, in technology that would support that kind of activity that rec could then leverage. So, I mean, crazy ideas. I think it's important to get those ideas out there so people begin to socialize them a little bit. And if we come back later with budget proposals for that, people can say, oh yeah, I read about that in the plan, and I think I understand what's going on there, as opposed to being, I don't understand that at all.
No, your point is very well taken. I agree.
That's the first step on the trip to a virtual reality town meeting. Everybody wears one of these.
We got an Oculus. I gotta tell you, it's pretty crazy.
Exactly. That 300 of us sitting around different locations.
Town supplied Oculuses.
Keep scrolling, please. There's a lot of stuff in the local government piece that's filler. So that is a huge.
I just wanted to quickly interject, Sam, as you and Kristen were talking, that your chart that you showed on recreation facilities is also contained in a different format in my open space, green initiatives, and rec chapter from the 2008. And this kind of gets back to what Judith talked about before, that things appeared in multiple places. So I think that'll be one of the other fine tunings, is to be able to not have things appear in multiple places, but maybe you'll say recreation facilities, as you can see in chapter 5, or I'll say the opposite, so that it doesn't appear in two places in slightly different formats.
Exactly. Cross-reference instead of replication. So
exactly. Yeah.
And the municipal finance, they've got a lot of text on the Prop 2.5 stuff that is now fairly ancient history. And again, we don't need to repeat again. So there's a lot of fluff that comes out of this one too, that we can refer back to the old plan. And again, update some charts. I think some charts here are useful in terms of context, in terms of fiscal resources for the town. But that one, hold on a second, Kat, what is this one? Having trouble reading these. The challenge that we have most recently is that as we look at growth of expenses and revenues, we actually now have relatively little headroom in terms of tax revenue, because there's a state limit on $25 per thousand property tax. And we're now at like $16 or $17, but it doesn't take a lot of extrapolation to predict that we may begin to approach that limit. And we have very little free levy capacity at this point as well. And so years ago, we had a lot of headroom to think about raising taxes if we chose to. We're getting to a point where we've got a lot less headroom to do that. And so at some point, even though the town may want to spend, you've got to go to something like override or whatever. But once you hit the $25, they've got to change state law to do that. So it becomes an interesting financial problem that we need to think about longer term. And that kind of thing, I think, is worth at least pointing out as a long range sort of radar kind of observation, that we've got to be cognizant of those kind of pressures here. And then the trick begins again to balance tax rate against growth. We get new buildings, new development can support some tax increase, but again, we don't have that many more buildable lots in town. So there's a question of how much we can expand tax base going forward. So it's a complicated, interrelated structure there financially that we continue to watch and manage, but we're getting into a place where we've got to be much more concerned about that than we were 10 years ago. So that story needs to be developed here. I haven't written that one yet, but that's on my list to do. And again, think about updating the chart. Do we need these charts? I haven't figured that one out completely. Keep scrolling, please. Okay, so here we go. These are the goals that I simply crossed out the ones we had and pasted in the new ones down here. And I need to go back and try to rationalize that, make sure that the goals are supported appropriately. Goals and strategies have the supporting text above, and if not, add stuff and make sure that there's linkages there that make sense. So at the bottom here, there's the paste in of the goals. And here we go, right down here. So again, I think Judith did more rewriting and actual surgery than I did, but I think we're headed in the same general direction as far as coming up with a more compact statement, remove duplication. And I think it's a great concept to refer back to the 2008 plan for more detail in some of these places. And we've got ultimately a much more readable document, much quicker trip to get to the bottom line for people to say, aha, here's what the proposal is, here's the direction we want to follow. So that's it for me. Any questions or comments? Thanks, Kat, for the technical assistance.
Yeah, thanks, Sam and Judith. So I did the same thing on land use, but I'm not as far as either of you. So I'll save that for another meeting. One question I had, and that we hadn't addressed because we started this process BC 2 years ago before coronavirus, is whether the pandemic has any effect on any of our goals or recommendations. Like anything, is the thought that once we hit herd immunity, everything will just go back to normal again, or will there be a difference in how office space is utilized, whether traffic will go back to the gridlock it was or not?
I think it's such an important question, Mimi. And didn't we include a question related to that in the survey? Like, how is the pandemic impacting what people see as, like, the survey that we did after the visioning?
Well, we did, but MAPC did not.
From economic development, I guess, perspective, that is definitely something that our committee's been talking about, more particularly in connection with vacancies on Route 9 and how, how that space might have to be repurposed, and maybe how that ties into our other diversity and housing and things like that. So that's certainly something that's on our minds. And another thing that the EDC is working with the Board of Selectmen on now is helping restaurants and other businesses extend the right to, or make permanent the right to have outdoor seating. So, I think that's something that might be useful in the future, even after we get mostly vaccinated. So in our committee. That's something that we're thinking about, how the world is changing in light of that. So I can certainly try to reflect
I think
that
if we don't
my
reflect that
chapter.
kind of stuff in the master plan, people are going to feel like we're just totally clueless.
Totally
We
out of
need to-
touch.
Yeah.
It's got to be there somewhere.
Where
right?
have you been?
Yeah.
Yep.
And the other thing is the use that like trails and open space has gotten.
Absolutely.
People have really been utilizing those assets.
More
and
than ever. Yep.
yeah.
Mhm.
So I think there should be some reference. It'd be strange to write a master plan during a pandemic and not have it come up at all.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, one of the ideas that Judith brought up to me today that I think is really interesting, and maybe there's some kind of introductory kind of paragraph, is do we have some like common themes or like values of the town that we talk about that kind of glue together all of our goals? Things like, really wanting more of a sense of community, or respecting the environment, or, wanting to create more green initiative. But I don't know, I'm just brainstorming now, but like, 4 or 5, like, here's some key themes that came out of our visioning and our discussions, and then therefore the goals feed from that. And I would think that one of the themes would be the recognition of the change in the world since the pandemic and how that impacts what we're focusing on as a town and as a community.
Good suggestion, Karen. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
It's
I think
the
that's
starting
I
point,
like that too.
Great way. Yeah.
overarching themes, if you will.
Is it outside of the scope? I'm just sort of thinking out loud, or does it make sense to address it in a way as far as, weathering difficult times as a community? I mean, I know things like, the food bank's been talking a lot about how they've been, much more heavily utilized than in the past, or talking about some ways that we can at least compile sort of community support services. I don't know if that's out of the scope of what we're doing.
No, I don't think so, Julian. In my opinion, it's not out of scope.
We can make the scope anything we want, basically.
Yeah, right. But, whether it's a pandemic or something else, or environmental factors, over, if we're looking at this being a long-term plan, there's always going to be times of difficulty, and whether it's economic or otherwise, maybe it makes sense to address that in light of this.
I think the pandemic has been a good lesson in that I can think of 2 groups, Youth and Family Services, for example. We fortuitously, a year or 2 ago, began to staff up there, and it turned out to be a great thing because they've been inundated with demands for service due to the pandemic. And the other one is the Board of Health, that had been woefully understaffed for years, and we're still playing catch up there. But I think, again, going forward, public health is going to be much more effectively supported more generally than we have historically. And again, I think that's a good thing in terms of being able not only to support pandemic, but other just general health in the population, as well as a safety net function for residents. One of the things that came out of the school population study, the projections, was the projection off of census data. I'm not quite sure I believe it, but it said that the senior population, I think it was over 60 years old, is going to increase by 50% over the next 10 years, which is a huge number. And again, there's an area that needs, I think, support in terms of public health kind of things, as far as access to healthcare, mobility, and so forth. So I think, again, the pandemic has at least inadvertently pushed some things that are, I think, going to be important going forward, and reinforcing some of those points, I think, could be helpful.
Yeah, and that definitely ties into our sense of community. And there are definitely
Absolutely.
different aspects, between health and recreation and accessibility and support services that all can be tied into that.
Yep. Good points.
I don't want to probably sidetrack the conversation today. It might be good for another meeting, but this conversation just has it's Kristen, sorry, has my head thinking, like, where's that line between the town, students that would be under, like, for example, Mark Purple's jurisdiction versus things we would put in this plan, and maybe there is no difference. I think I'm starting to, just this discussion is trying to, I don't want to say make me confused, but it makes me think, where's that line? or maybe there is no line. Like I said, I just, when we start talking about responses to pandemics, I think it's a great point, because I can look at rec alone and, you know, how much they have matured in this area. And obviously it's somewhere we want to stay on top of versus them being reactionary. A lot's been learned. So it's almost like we always need that in the back pocket. So I think that should advise some of our goals. And I think it's an excellent point. Where does that line stop in what we're doing versus what the town administration is responsible for? And I just, the lines are a little blurry for me right now.
I think this drives the town administration. I think that, you know, the challenge always is sort of who's elected, who reports to whom kind of stuff. But I think there ought to be, out of this, to me at least, great pressure to support goals that in many cases require the various entities to work together to make things happen. So you got the Board of Selectmen, you got the Board of Health, the library trustees, and the school committees, all independently elected bodies that technically don't have to work together necessarily, and sometimes don't. But to me, this master plan, I think, could be a force to reinforce. Here are key goals, identifying places where various entities need to work together to be successful. And then, you know, various members of us who are participants in some of those groups have an opportunity to create pressure to make those things happen going forward. So I think we got a very broad scope, Kristen, that we can choose for some of these things. And maybe that's difficult or take a lot of time to do, or maybe even impossible. But I think you try to do the thing that makes sense and see what you can do.
Sam, you know I back that up. But it just has me thinking about this a little differently.
Okay. So
Okay.
I think it, you know, it's, I do think that's an interesting one. And I know we've, I mean, I've talked to a couple of people about it in relation to, you know, what do you, like, where do you draw the line between what's in the master plan and what is basically what I think of as the operational charters of, you know, town government. So if I think about, let's think about the Conservation Commission as an example. I wouldn't expect to see a reference to the Conservation Commission being responsible for the implementation of the Wetland Protection Acts and the town bylaw on stormwater permitting in the master plan, because that is their operational charter. That's what they're there to do. But what's in the master plan in relation to the Conservation Commission is a specific goal around making sure that all town property that's got a conservation restriction on it is under the care and control of the Conservation Commission, which isn't the case right now. So for me, it's this kind of the distinction between this is business as usual, what these departments or boards are responsible for on an ongoing basis, and here's some more strategic things that are going to change what they do, or we're asking them to do more or to do things differently. That to me is how you make the distinction there.
But your comments are good, because I see, for example, a potential outcome for Concom to collect the properties that ought to be under the care and control of the Conservation Commission, and then work to coordinate with recreation, for example, open space, to make sure that those properties that are appropriate for public access and use get utilized in the most effective way going forward. So there's sort of a pressure to not only, you know, do the management piece, but to do coordination in terms of access where it's appropriate, to support, you know, public access in ways that are consistent with some of the goals out of the master plan. So I don't think anybody intends to micromanage how Concom or anybody else does these things, but we can set up a list of higher order objectives that require support and management activity by various elements here, whether it's the town administrator or the school administration or whatever. So I mean, I think it can fit, but we may run into places where there's some, I don't know, inconsistencies or conflicts. But until you get more of the text out there to look at, I think it's hard to predict some of these things. I think that's sort of where we're going next, is to get enough meat around some of these things that we can say, aha, this fits or this doesn't fit. We got a problem we got to resolve.
So that does lead me to raise one topic, and I think I talked with Mimi about this week. So we're working on the report sections, and it's definitely going to take, probably another couple of months to get there. But I do think this might be the time, Sam, to get the goals and recommendations as they stand in front of the Board of Selectmen. What's your thought about that? Because we've got some, nicely set up and formatted goals and recommendations now. My worry would be if we wait till we have the final report, we're going to get close to the town meeting, and then we won't have, had the opportunity or given the Board of Selectmen the opportunity to look at some of these things. And I worry that, they'll go, oh no, tear that up and start again. Maybe they won't, because you and Lisa are there and you'll bully them into saying, yay, great job, everyone.
We haven't done too much of that, tear it up and start over, but typically get a little bit of input. I think that is not a bad idea. I guess it seems to me that if I sort of try to step back from it and think about if I hadn't been involved in this so much, I would be interested in, I guess, in seeing maybe a pass at the overarching themes that Karen suggested, a pass at the outline. Here are the sections that we're working on, and then here is a first pass at some of the goals, strategies, etc. At a high level, sort of they can see the shape of the whole thing as opposed to an isolated piece of it. And maybe a few comments about the structure as far as, again, re-emphasizing the various parts that need to work together. Coordination, integration is an important thing. Less detailed than the 2008 plan because that's already been done, et cetera, et cetera. So some sort of summary points that talk about where we're going so folks can get a better sense of how the whole fits together as opposed to one particular snapshot piece. And I think that we're actually positioned to be able to do that fairly quickly. We could maybe work on some of that between now and the next meeting and review that with the group. Selectmen's agendas, which I have remarkably little control over, are pretty well set now for the next month here almost, it looks like, particularly with the budget. Town meeting is probably not going to happen until May or June. So we have a little bit more time to do some things before then. So maybe, Judith, to think about a discussion in early March or something to get on an agenda. And so
Right.
here's what we want to do. And Lisa is the best one to get that on the agenda. So we haven't seen her here for a while, but I think that would be, Mimi, that would be a good thing to maybe suggest and see what
More
her.
influential than you then. I'm just sharing something that, and I know everybody, so just so everybody knows, I am keeping this, can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
I can't read it, but I can see it.
Beautiful Excel spreadsheet that everyone went, I can't read it. Up to date. This was the summary that we did look at one point. This does it's a pretty good one pager in terms of the objectives and the overall goals. So maybe that's something that we can
something like that would be useful. Again, and I think that getting something on the agenda for discussion or this brief review and the mid-course correction, here's where we're headed, and let people react however.
Mid-course, we're not doing this for another 2 years, Sam. I just want
So just so everyone understands, this doesn't need to be like voted on at town meeting or anything. It's a planning document that's accepted by the planning board and that's reviewed with the planning board and the board of selectmen.
But it would be good to have available for a town meeting distribution so people know.
Correct. Right. But I just, it's not going to be a warrant article or anything.
Yes. But again, Mimi, I would think of the conversation with Lisa to say, you know, here's what we talked about, and does it make sense to try to get it on agenda for a brief update, for example, and any input that the board might have to offer would be a good step, just to be sure there aren't wildly different views of what's going on here.
Sure.
And I can work to manage criticism at that point with no guarantee of success.
Yeah, and I was thinking of how to best share where we are with the planning board. I was thinking of just having all the goal and recommendation documents that are on our Dropbox put on the planning board's Dropbox for
You could do that.
the planning board members to review.
I still like the idea, again, having, as Karen suggested, some sort of a story overall, to give people a sense of context for
Kind of like guiding principles or key
road-
themes or
roadmap,
that kind of thing.
roadmap and, you know, guiding principles, then chapter outline, and a few bullet points about here are some concepts that we're working on in terms of the detailed text, and then here's the current pass at the goals and strategies or whatever that come out of this. And that would be helpful to me to sort of understand the scope and the breadth of the whole thing here in a way that is concise enough that I can get a feel for it as I dive into pieces that I'm interested in.
Yeah. So maybe Sarah, you and I can chat to figure out how best to try
Sounds
and
good.
present that.
Sure.
All right. So we will thank you, Judith and Sam and Gina, for your work thus far on your chapters. I'll continue plugging away and be ready to show something next meeting. And hopefully everybody else is working on theirs as well.
Get out your scissors and your chainsaws to approach the.
Hey, actually, really quick, I just had two questions from the Rec Commission from last night. One was what is our, and I should really know this, but I know we are all working on it, and now that we're actively working on it, what's our ideal target for all of us to be done?
Well, Sam said we're at the halfway point.
That's right.
Well, our goal is to have a draft for town meetings. So in the
To be determined.
the goal line just got moved up to some indeterminate date.
But
Probably in June would be my guess.
Yeah.
but
When was it last year? That's when it was last year.
It was
right?
in June last year.
Yeah, outside. But Kristen, I guess my thought was that if we can have, you know, the various input pieces from the different committees and groups in the next month here, I think that gives us a shot at having at least much of the material in place pretty soon.
That's fair. Yep.
And
My second question, and I think we touched on it or actually, Sam, you touched on it, was how much of our work overlaps or is integrating with the capital plan committee?
Probably a fair amount from various areas, but I don't think we have to worry about that quite yet until we see, again, a little more detail on some of the various areas, and then we can sort of try to figure out how to connect the pieces on that. But I think, again, capital plan typically could involve a fairly broad range of things that are happening in these various areas.
Okay, thank you. I think that was all of their questions, so thank you.
Okay.
Okay, are we ready to approve minutes?
I am.
From January 13th?
I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes as proposed. I didn't have any changes.
Okay, any second?
I'll second it.
Any discussion? No? Okay.
Perfect as usual.
The minutes are unbelievable. I enjoy reading them.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
Better than enough.
So all in favor? Signs?
Aye.
Latrell, yes. Warren?
Yes.
Stivers?
Yes.
Watson?
Yep.
McKee?
Yes.
Markalier?
Yes.
Savidovich?
Yes.
Connolly?
Yes.
Glazemitsky?
Yes.
Lavalde?
Yes.
Very good.
Okay.
So our next meeting is scheduled for March 10th. Is that still okay?
Yes.
Very good.
What's the plan for next time, Mimi? Are we going to have people review several more of the chapters here, maybe, or?
Yeah, I'll have land use and zoning
Okay.
in much better shape.
And I guess I can certainly keep working on mine and maybe have a better version to at least put on the shared drive to let people take a look at some of that as well and keep working those things.
And between Tom and I, we should have, a red line version of the housing as well.
And
Great.
Mimi, March 10th is fine. I'm just noticing that it's not in my calendar. I don't know if it's in other people's calendars. I don't know if a invite was sent out that far ahead.
No, I haven't sent out.
Okay, just double checking to make sure I'm
Look
not
for
missing
it
something.
tonight.
Oh, cool. All right, I will.
I have to do it immediately or I'll forget.
Yeah.
And Karen, it's Kristen. Maybe it's just like in an argument with my son who told me I wasn't on mute, even though I was. But maybe it was, I'm like, I'm on mute, don't worry. But maybe we should just catch up on our chapter.
I'd love to. Yeah, what I can do is send you my sort of work in progress where I've left out anything related to rec, and it would be awesome to collaborate with you on that, Kristen. That would be great.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
And second?
Second.
Very good. Signs?
Mute.
Aye.
Latrell, yes. Warren?
Yes.
Stivers?
Yes.
Watson?
Yes.
McKee?
Yes.
Markalier?
Yes.
Savidovich?
Yes.
Connolly?
Yes.
Glazemitsky?
Yes.
And Lavalde.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Night, everybody.
Cool.
Night.
Have a good